In the summer of 1787, a small printed book began landing on some of the most powerful desks in London. One copy went to King George III, the man who ruled over the largest empire on the face of the earth. Another went to Edmund Burke, one of the most respected political minds in the British Parliament. For anyone watching this who isn't deeply familiar with British history, here is the quick version of why that empire mattered. By the late 1700s, Great Britain controlled territory and trade routes spanning the globe, from the Caribbean to India to the coasts of West Africa. And a massive share of its wealth was being generated by one specific, horrifying business: the buying, transporting, and forced labor of enslaved African people. At that moment, Great Britain was not just a kingdom, it was the dominant force in the transatlantic slave trade, a system that had already dragged millions of African men, women, and children across the ocean in chains, and that system was defended again and again using the Bible itself. British ministers stood in pulpits and told their congregations that slavery was sanctioned by Scripture, that Africans were marked for servitude by divine order, and that the wealth pouring into England from sugar, cotton, and human bondage was, in some twisted way, the will of God. And then this book arrived. It was not written by a bishop. It was not written by a member of parliament. It was written by a man who, 17 years earlier, had been a 13-year-old boy playing in a field on the coast of West Africa before he was seized, chained, and sold like cargo. His name was Ottobah Cugoano, and what he did with that book was, by any honest measure, audacious. He picked up the very same Bible that slaveholders were using to defend their crimes, and he turned it against them, line by line, until the moral foundation they were standing on began to crack. So here is the question this video is going to answer. How did a kidnapped African child grow into the man whose words made the British establishment visibly uncomfortable? And why, almost 240 years later, do most Americans who love history still have never heard his name? Stay with this one, because by the end, you are going to understand exactly why this document mattered, and you might find yourself asking why it was allowed to fade. Ottobah Cugoano was born around the year 1757 in a town called Ajumaco in the Fante region of what is today Ghana, along what Europeans called the Gold Coast. His early life was shaped by the household of a local Fante chief named Ambro Akassa, a leader of Ajumaco and Asini, and by all accounts his childhood, before the moment that changed everything, was ordinary. He was a boy among other boys, growing up in a coastal society with its own structures, its own trade networks, and its own politics, much of which had already been deeply entangled with European traders for generations. That entanglement is part of this story too, because the record shows that the people who first seized Cugoano were not European raiders storming the coast. They were fellow Africans operating within a brutal commercial system that had been built and fed by demand from European merchants. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it is a documented one, and it is part of what makes Cugoano's own writing so striking, because in his later book, he does not flinch from describing it. In the year 1770, when he was about 13 years old, Cugoano was out with a group of other children, somewhere between 15 and 20 boys and girls, playing in a field not far from the coast. It was an afternoon like any other, until it wasn't. Armed men appeared, and the children were seized. Cugoano later described how some of them tried to run, only to be met with weapons and threats that anyone who attempted escape would be killed on the spot. Within days, he had gone from a boy playing in a field to a captive marched toward the sea, and from there, loaded onto a slave ship bound for the Caribbean. Think about that for a second, and then ask yourself this in the comments. How many of us, at 13 years old, could have survived what came next, let alone gone on to challenge an empire? He was taken to the island of Grenada in the West Indies and put to work on a plantation, enduring the same brutal labor system that defined the sugar economy of the Caribbean. He spent roughly 2 years there, 2 years that are barely documented in detail, but that we know from the broader historical record of plantation slavery in that period were marked by violence, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. Grenada in the early 1770s was one of the most productive sugar colonies in the entire Caribbean, which meant it was also one of the deadliest places on earth to be enslaved, because sugar cultivation demanded relentless, grinding labor in brutal heat, and plantation owners across the region routinely calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and replace them than to treat them humanely. A 13-year-old boy thrown into that system would have had almost no margin for error and almost no protection. He survived it. That alone tells you something about the man who would later have the nerve to publish a direct theological challenge to the entire British establishment. Then, in late 1772, his life took another sharp turn. A Scottish merchant named Alexander Campbell purchased him and brought him across the Atlantic again, this time to England itself. And it was in England, almost by accident of timing, that Cugoano stepped into a legal and moral gray zone that would change the course of his life. Just months before he arrived, a British court had ruled in what became known as the Somerset case, a decision that effectively declared an enslaved person could not be forcibly removed from England against their will. It did not abolish slavery outright, and it did not free every enslaved person on English soil, but it cracked the legal foundation just enough that Cugoano was able to gain his own freedom not long after arriving. In August of 1773, he was baptized at St. James's Church in Piccadilly, in the heart of London, under the name John Stuart. He learned to read, he learned to write, and in a city that was, at that very moment, one of the financial engines of the global slave trade, a formerly enslaved African boy was teaching himself the tools of the very language his captors used to justify what had been done to him. By 1784, Cugoano had entered the household of the celebrated court painter Richard Cosway and his wife Maria, working in a position that placed him in regular contact with some of the most fashionable and politically connected circles in London. This is a detail worth sitting with because it means the man who would soon write one of the most direct anti-slavery documents of the 18th century was not writing from the margins of society. He was writing from inside rooms where British aristocrats, artists, and politicians actually gathered. Around this same period, he became part of a small but determined group of free and formerly enslaved black men in London who called themselves the Sons of Africa. This group, which also included his friend Ottobah Cugoano, wrote letters to newspapers, petitioned members of Parliament, and organized what historians now recognize as one of the earliest examples of organized black political activism in British history. They met, they corresponded, they coordinated, and they understood with remarkable clarity for the time that the written word published under their own real names carried a different kind of weight than second-hand sympathy from white reformers, however well-intentioned. Cugoano was no longer simply a survivor of slavery. He was becoming something else entirely, a witness who intended to put his testimony on permanent, public record. That record arrived in 1787 in the form of a book with a long and deliberate title, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species, humbly submitted to the inhabitants of Great Britain. And here is where this story stops being simply a biography and becomes something much sharper, because the real weapon in this book was not just Cugoano's personal account of being kidnapped, though that account is in there too, raw and direct. The real weapon was theological. pro-slavery writers in Britain had spent decades leaning on one particular passage from the book of Genesis, the story of Noah's son Ham, twisting it into a claim that African people were the cursed descendants of Ham, condemned by God himself to perpetual servitude. It was a convenient lie, repeated from pulpits and printed in pamphlets, dressed up as sacred truth to soothe the conscience of a nation profiting from human bondage. Cugoano went directly at this argument. He laid out the biblical genealogy in detail, tracing the line of descent the slaveholders claimed to be citing, walking through exactly which sons settled in which lands, exactly which peoples were supposedly being described, and methodically showed that their reading did not hold together, that the text simply did not say what they needed it to say. This was not a man reciting borrowed talking points. This was someone who had clearly studied the source material with the same rigor a trained clergyman would have brought to it, and then used that rigor to take the argument apart piece by piece. He was not attacking the Bible, he was attacking the dishonest use of the Bible, and he did it on its own terms, in its own language, which made the argument almost impossible for a church-going British reader to simply dismiss. But Cugoano did not stop at dismantling the curse of Ham. He reached for a second, even more dangerous biblical comparison, one that every literate Christian in 18th century Britain would have known by heart, the story of the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt and their deliverance through the book of Exodus. This was the story of an entire people held in forced bondage by a powerful nation, put to brutal labor, their suffering ignored by their rulers, until that suffering provoked a reckoning. In the biblical account, God did not bless Egypt for enslaving the Hebrews. God judged Egypt for it. Cugoano placed that exact framework in front of his British readers and effectively asked them to finish the sentence themselves. If their own scripture taught that a nation which enslaves another people invites catastrophe and divine judgment, then what exactly did they imagine was coming for a nation that had built its wealth on the chained bodies of Africans, on a scale far larger than anything described in Exodus? Cugoano warned, in language striking enough that it is documented in the original text itself, that Britain, having become the leading nation in this trade, ought to be the first to abandon it, lest what he called an impending calamity burst upon them as a just retribution for what he described as their enormous crimes. Sit with that phrase for a second, a just retribution for enormous crimes. That is not soft language, that is the language of a courtroom, and Cugoano was building his case in front of the only jury he had access to, the reading public of Great Britain. This is, honestly, one of the most underappreciated rhetorical maneuvers in the entire history of the abolitionist movement. And here is a question worth dropping in the comments. Why do you think Exodus, of all biblical stories, hit differently than almost any other argument Cugoano could have made? Part of the answer is that Exodus was not some obscure passage. It was, and still is, one of the most universally recognized stories in Western religious culture, a story about bondage, suffering, and ultimately liberation under divine authority. 18th century Britain was a deeply church-going society. Sermons on Exodus were preached in parish churches across the country every single year. The story was read aloud to congregations who knew every plague, every act of defiance from Pharaoh, every step of the journey out of bondage. When Cugoano placed Atlantic slavery directly inside that frame, he was not asking British Christians to adopt some foreign moral standard. He was holding up a mirror made entirely of their own sacred text and asking them to recognize the reflection. He was, in effect, telling slaveholding Britain, you already know how this story ends for the nation that holds the chains, because your own book told you centuries ago, and your own preachers have been reading it to you your entire life. That is not a minor literary flourish. That is a documented, deliberate, and devastating piece of moral argumentation, written by a man who had been enslaved himself and who understood, better than any bishop in London, exactly what was at stake in getting the theology right. It is worth pausing here to be precise about what this argument was, and just as importantly, what it was not. Cugoano was not claiming that Africans were literally the lost tribes of Israel, and he was not building some alternate genealogy to argue that his own Fante people were biologically or ancestrally Hebrew. That is not what is documented in the text, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. What he was doing was something arguably more powerful, using the moral architecture of a story his readers already believed in, the bondage and deliverance of Exodus, as a tool to prosecute a present-day crime. He was a named, literate, first-hand witness, using a real, surviving, printed document to put his captors on trial in the court of their own conscience. That distinction matters, and it is exactly why this book deserves to be read as a work of strategy and intellect, not just as a victim's testimony. It would have been easy, and in some ways more comfortable for modern audiences, if Cugoano had simply written a tearful memoir asking for pity. He did not do that. He wrote a legal-style brief built on the moral logic of his readers' own faith, demanding that they recognize what they were doing and stop. That choice, to argue rather than plead, is part of what makes this document so remarkable, and it is worth asking yourself why a document this sharp, this confrontational, has not made it into more classrooms. The book did not stay quietly on a shelf either. Copies were deliberately sent to King George III and to Edmund Burke, men whose opinions carried enormous weight in shaping British policy. Cugoano did not manage to change the king's mind. George III remained opposed to abolition, along with much of the royal establishment. But the attempt itself tells you something important about how Cugoano understood his own work. He was not writing a private memoir for sympathy. He was submitting evidence to the highest levels of British power, formally, deliberately, by name. And within the text itself, he went further than almost any other abolitionist writer of his era was willing to go in print, arguing not just for the gradual reform that many sympathetic British reformers were calling for, but for the immediate and total abolition of the slave trade and the emancipation of every enslaved person, full stop. He even argued that enslaved people had not just the right, but the moral duty to resist and escape their bondage by any means available to them. In a political climate where even sympathetic white reformers were cautiously proposing gradual, decades-long phase-outs of the trade, Cugoano, writing as a formerly enslaved African addressing the British public directly, was demanding it end now. That is documented in the text, and it is frankly one of the boldest political demands made in print in Britain in that entire century. None of this happened in isolation. Cugoano's work moved in tandem with the broader activity of the Sons of Africa, the small circle of black abolitionists in London who used every tool available to them: letters to newspapers, appearances at public meetings, direct engagement with members of Parliament who were beginning to organize the first formal push toward abolition legislation. Picture what that actually required in 1787. Men who had themselves been legally classified as property, walking into the offices of the most powerful lawmakers in the British Empire, signing their own names to public letters, and demanding to be taken seriously as political actors rather than objects of pity. That alone was a radical act, regardless of what the letters said. 2 years after Cugoano's book appeared, his close friend and fellow Sons of Africa member Ottobah Cugoano would publish his own widely read autobiography, a work that many of you watching this channel already know well from earlier episodes, so we will not retread that ground here. What matters for this story is that Cugoano's 1787 text predates Cugoano's famous narrative, and in many ways it set the theological and rhetorical table that the broader British abolitionist movement would continue to build on for the next 2 decades, all the way through to the eventual passage of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which formally ended Britain's participation in the transatlantic trade in human beings, though not slavery itself within the colonies, which would take decades longer to dismantle. So why isn't Ottobah Cugoano a household name in the way that Equiano has become? That is a genuinely open question, and historians themselves are still wrestling with it. Some scholars point out that Cugoano's prose is denser and more theologically demanding than Equiano's vivid, narrative-driven autobiography, making it a harder sell to general readers across the centuries. Others note that Cugoano's demand for immediate, total abolition, combined with his argument that enslaved people had a moral right to violent self-liberation, was simply too radical and too uncomfortable for many readers, then and arguably now, compared to the more palatable gradualist tone of other abolitionist literature. It is also worth noting, and being fair about, that recent scholarship in philosophy and history has actually begun actively re-examining Cugoano's text after a long stretch of relative neglect in academic circles, recognizing it as one of the most sophisticated political arguments produced by a formerly enslaved writer in the 18th century. So this is not a story of some secret being hidden by powerful interests. It is a story of a genuinely radical, theologically sharp piece of testimony that for a complex mix of reasons simply did not travel as far into popular memory as it deserved to. And that raises the real question for you, the viewer. In a country like the United States, where Exodus imagery would go on to become absolutely central to the language of the abolitionist and later civil rights movements, why do you think the man who pioneered turning that exact biblical story into a direct legal-style indictment of an empire still isn't part of the story most people learn? Drop your theory in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of debate this channel exists to have with you. What we are left with in the end is a documented, verifiable record. A 13-year-old boy from Ajumako, kidnapped from a field on the Gold Coast in 1770, who survived plantation slavery in Grenada, gained his freedom on English soil in the legal aftershock of the Somerset case, taught himself to read and write, worked his way into the households of London's elite, helped found one of the first organized black political movements in British history, and then, in 1787, picked up the same book his oppressors used to justify his suffering and used it to write what may be the most direct biblical indictment of the slave trade published in Britain up to that point. He sent it to the king. He sent it to Parliament, and while he did not live to see total abolition, the record shows that his argument, his structure, his refusal to let Exodus be read as anything other than a warning to enslaving nations, became part of the intellectual foundation that the broader abolitionist movement continued to build on for the next 20 years. It is also worth remembering just how much that single rhetorical move, turning Exodus into a warning rather than a footnote, would go on to echo far beyond Cugoano's own lifetime. Decades later, on the other side of the Atlantic, enslaved Americans would sing about Moses, about Pharaoh, about crossing over to freedom, building an entire spiritual vocabulary of resistance out of that same story. Generations after that, the language of Exodus would return again in the sermons and speeches of the American Civil Rights Movement. None of that happened because of Cugoano alone, of course. It happened because Exodus was simply that powerful a story for anyone living under bondage on either side of the ocean. But it is worth knowing that one of the very first people to put that comparison into print, by name, directly addressed to the ruling power that benefited from slavery, was a Fante man writing from London in 1787, several decades before any of those later echoes existed. That is not a small footnote in the story of how this idea traveled. That is arguably one of its earliest documented starting points. If this is the first time you are hearing the name Ottobah Cugoano, you are not alone, and that is exactly the point of this channel, pulling these documented, real, named witnesses out of the margins of history and putting them back where they belong, front and center. If you want us to keep doing exactly this kind of deep dive into the real written testimony of people who lived through the slave trade and fought back with the only weapons they had, words, evidence, and their own names, let us know in the comments which forgotten witness you want us to cover next. And if this story moved you even slightly, do us a favor and share it, because the only way names like Cugoano stop being forgotten is if people like you decide to carry them forward.